Thank you all for coming. My name is Paris Denard. I'm the events director here at the McCain Institute. We are going to begin momentarily, but I wanted to just encourage you to first, if you have a cell phone or any type of mobile device, to put it on vibrate or silent. But don't turn it off, because we want you to participate and be active throughout the duration of today's panel. Inside of the program, you'll see we have the Twitter handles for all of our participants. And the hashtag for today's event is hashtag Leadership Voices, because this is part of our Leadership Voices series. So let people know where you are. If you are on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, if you are on Twitter, please use the hashtag Leadership Voices, and we can be found at McCain Institute. So please let people know where you are and participate actively throughout the duration of the panel. And we shall begin just momentarily. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon and welcome. I see a lot of friends here already. My name is Kurt Volker. I'm Executive Director of the McCain Institute. And we wanted to put on an event today, different from the usual style of events that we've been doing. We've been doing very large debates over foreign policy issues. We do interviews with leaders about leadership. But there's a special occasion here that we wanted to take note of, and it poses some very challenging issues for the United States government and, frankly, for the international community, and we wanted to bring that out. The McCain Institute is part of Arizona State University, and it was founded principally as a way of promoting character-driven leadership. What is the role of values and character in shaping the decisions that we need to make as individuals, as a country, as a broader democratic community? Components to that are human rights, humanitarian action, including a lot of work we've done on fighting human trafficking, and national security. And that's really it's the nexus of these things. How do you understand human rights and national security together in the same conversation? That is part of the way the Institute was developed. And frankly, that's one of the reasons why I think this panel discussion we've organized today is so important, because dealing with mass atrocities, preventing genocide, is one of those issues where these humanitarian and national security challenges are intertwined. I'm delighted to be able to partner today with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and with Human Rights First, organizations that are deeply committed to human rights and fitting them into the ways we make decisions as a country. And of course, we have representatives from them on our panel discussion today. Also have another special note to make. The McCain Institute is constituted with an advisory board of trustees. And last year, one of our very distinguished trustees members passed away, Ambassador Rich Williamson. Rich personally also embodied this commitment to human rights, to action, and to national security. And that was reflected in many of the positions that he held in government and many of the things that he did in his career as a lawyer and advisor outside of government. Everything from serving as National Security Advisor in the Romney campaign in 2012 to his work in the State Department or as an envoy abroad in Africa, dealing with Sudan or sub-Saharan Africa. And it is really a great loss that he's no longer with us. And I wanted at this point to welcome his widow, Jane Williamson, and their family. I'm going to get this wrong, but Lisa, Ryan Graham, and Craig. So thank you all for being here. And I'd like to and I'd like to just turn it over to Jane Williamson for a moment to say a few words, if you would, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Volker, for those kind remarks, and thanks to the McCain Institute for honoring Rich in this very special way today. As many of you know, Rich was passionate about human rights and spent the last several years working on ways to stop mass atrocities. His experience in Sudan was life-changing for him, and reinforced his commitment to the responsibility to protect. His collaboration with Michael Abramowitz and Madeleine Albright last year was something he so valued and believed could make a difference. He had such great admiration for those of you in this room who devote yourselves to this noble cause, and I know he was honored to be in your midst as you work together to solve one of the world's most pressing and disturbing problems. On behalf of my family, some of whom you have met, but not all, I extend my most heartfelt gratitude for this special recognition of someone who cared so deeply about the very issues before you. Thank you for honoring him today.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for making the special effort to be here today as we conduct this discussion. The issue on the table is the Rwanda genocide 20 years later. Have we learned our lessons? And I think there are several aspects to this that will come out in the conversation. Both what happened, what did we do or not do at the time, what do we learn from that, and are we really applying those lessons today when you look at other challenges in the world such as Syria? In order to lead us through this conversation, I'd like to introduce our moderator. He is the executive editor of Foreign Policy, Ben Pauker.
Hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today looking at the legacy of the Rwandan genocide 20 years later. And I want to thank Ambassador Volker and the McCain Institute for assembling such an extraordinary panel of experts and for having me here today. And thanks to all of you for coming and being indoors on a day when I think we'd all like to be outdoors. But before we talk about where we are 20 years after this horrific event, I'd like us to go back in time a bit and just sort of set ourselves back in the moment of the Rwandan genocide. Today is May 1st. By this time in 1994, the massacres in Rwanda had been raging for 23 days. Radio stations were still at full blare, inciting Hutus to kill cockroach Tutsis. Paul Kagame and the RPF army were slowly gaining territory in the north and making their way toward the capital. Hundreds of thousands of Rwandans had already crossed into Tanzania, Burundi and Zaire fleeing the violence. And here in Washington, a meeting was held among working-level Pentagon officers responsible for the day-to-day management of the crisis and assessing where things stood. And I'd like to read briefly from a document that came out today, 20 years ago. At the top it says, IWG is the Internal Working Group's 6 short-term policy objectives. 1, to stop the ongoing massacres as quickly as possible, through contacts with the government of Rwanda and RPF leaders and démarches for similar representation with neighboring states. 2, to support the UN and others in attempts to achieve a ceasefire. And here there's a note, and it says, need to change attempts to political efforts. Without political, there is a danger of signing up to troop contributions. 3, to encourage Tanzanian and other attempts to resume negotiations under the Arusha framework. 4, to seek to prevent violence from spreading outside Rwanda through contacts with neighboring states. 5, to push the UN to launch an immediate expanded humanitarian assistance effort. 6, to prevent a similar round of slaughter and disorder in Burundi. 7, it says, urge all parties to keep borders open for refugee flows. And here comes the kicker. Under issues for discussion, number 1, genocide investigation, that's underlined. Language that calls for an international investigation of human rights abuses and possible violations of the Genocide Convention. Be careful. Legal Aid State was worried about this yesterday. Genocide finding could commit U.S. government to actually, quote, do something. Today, one hopes we've come a long way from this now infamous language and from a world where we blithely watch crises unfold. Rwanda has come back from the ashes and is a relatively peaceful and economically buoyant state, though not one without its critics. We've seen the birth of humanitarian intervention and the codification of the responsibility to protect. And yet we see around us today a host of international conflicts that compel action, and where action to prevent massacres and potential genocides in the making is not forthcoming. In Syria, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, to name just a few, we see human tragedy on a horrific scale. So what can we do? And have we learned our lesson? To kick us off, I want to introduce our panelists here. From the left, Clemantine Wamariya, a survivor of the Rwandan Genocide who was just 6 years old when the violence began. Today, she's a fellow alumnus of New Trier High School, a graduate of Yale, sits on the board of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and is an impassioned and well-traveled human rights supporter. Elisa Massimino, the president and CEO of Human Rights First, whose decades of work on everything from injustice in Egypt to torture in U.S. detention facilities challenge America to uphold its highest ideals. Ambassador Fred Hoff, a former Army officer, a State Department official, resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center in the Middle East, and special advisor for the transition in Syria. And finally, Mike Abramowitz, a longtime correspondent and editor at the Washington Post, and now the director of the National Institute for Holocaust Education at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So Clemantine, I want to start with you. You were just in Rwanda for the commemoration of the 20th anniversary on April 7th of this year. Tell us a little bit about what that meant to you, and walk us through the experiences 20 years ago and how that resonated with you on that day.
20 years ago. It's a sleep away. It's a sound away. It's not any time away. And being in Rwanda with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, community unconscious members and counselors, I realized that my world had collided. And as we sat in the stadium Amahoro, listening one speech after another about how far the country has come, about how far the country is, and all the progress that has been made, I couldn't help but smile because it was my 5th time going back. But being in one place, seeing the people around me, I realized, wow, this is the same place where I feared as a child. But now I could sit and listen. But also, and Michael could talk about this later on, people were crying. People were crying as if their family members were being murdered right in front of them. And so, being back in my own country and listening to the cries, mostly women, I thought, when someone has taken your family away, when someone has taken everything away from you, 20 years is nothing. 50 years is nothing, because every day you'll be thinking of them. Every day you'll be wishing that they will be there. So I am still processing, but what I realize is that 20 years for Rwanda, in terms of progress, we're so far away, but in terms of the pain that we still hold, that's still in us, it's not anywhere yet. It's still in all of us.
Mike, you were there as well. Maybe you can give us a little bit of the broader context of where we've come. You know, sometimes it seems to me that we've gone from never again to, I can't believe this is happening again.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the McCain Institute, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with 3 friends of mine, and also to Kurt. I just want to say a word because many of you in this room may not have known anything about Rich Williamson, and I just wanted to say a word about him because he was one of the closest collaborators that we had at the museum over the last 5 years, and we miss him a lot. He was someone who cared passionately about the prevention of genocide, and he would do anything to help us in our mission, which is to try to prevent future genocides. And so it's just an honor for me to be here with his family, and it's not a week that goes by. I know you think about him more, but I think about him a lot, and I really miss him. So You know, the issue of preventing genocide, I was with Clemantine in Rwanda with other members of our board. We took a delegation from the U.S. Holocaust Museum led by our chairman, Tom Bernstein, really to express our solidarity with the victims of the genocide and the survivors. In the audience, my friend Margit Meissner, who's a survivor volunteer at our museum. Margit, you should raise your hand. She's an incredible lady, 92 years old, escapee from Nazi-occupied France, and she came with us on our trip, and she had, there was a real connection between her and other survivors, which is something you learn when you're at the Holocaust Museum, that there's this kind of connection between survivors of different genocides. Every genocide is unique. The Holocaust obviously was a unique event in human history, but the experiences of survivors is very unusual, is very similar. 2 points that I think I would just to start off the conversation about Rwanda. I think one reason why it's so important to try to prevent genocide or these mass atrocities before they start is because there's a long impact. We are still 20 years later living in the region, in the East Africa, with the impact of the genocide. Obviously, the country itself, it has done an impressive job in recovering, but reconciliation is still a very difficult thing to achieve. Number two, the horrendous conflict in Congo, which has taken the lives of some estimated 4 or 5 million people, terrible crimes, including really Eastern Congo being one of the rape capitals of the world. It's all a direct result of, or in some ways, directly flowed from the Rwandan genocide. So while you want to stop these atrocities because they're terrible in their own right, these are things that stay with us for a long time. Number two, I would also make the point that when you work on an issue like genocide and mass atrocities, it's very easy to get depressed and to really point out the failures. And I think today we will have ample time to point out the failures. But I do sincerely believe that because of the work of people like Rich and the people on this panel and others in this room, we have made progress in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, we did not have an international criminal court. We did not have these tribunals to try the perpetrators of major war crimes. So we now have a system of justice. If you are the leader of a country that is considering genocide, I think you have to think twice about it because you might end up in The Hague. And I'm not saying that it's a total deterrent, but I believe that there is a deterrent effect. We now have the idea of the responsibility to protect. I think that's an important international doctrine. It's the one that, again, that we worked on with Rich and Madeleine Albright. This is a doctrine that says what happens in another country, if it rises to ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, if the country in question is not willing to stop those crimes, then it's up to the broader international community. We've obviously had an uneven record in implementing the responsibility to protect, but at least it sets a standard for what we're trying to achieve. And I also believe that in a number of cases, we have had some progress. I think of a place like Kenya, which 5 years ago experienced a terrible bout of ethnic-oriented violence after the election, just had a relatively peaceful election. And there was a lot of focus among the Kenyans themselves and on the international community in trying to prevent. In South Sudan, which regrettably has had a recurrence of violence, but there was a lot of work among NGOs, the US government, the European community, and the countries themselves in trying to prevent violence when they had the referendum 3 years ago. And that went off relatively peacefully. So we can talk about Syria. I know we'll get to Syria. It's a terrible failure of the world. But I do see that some progress has been made since Rwanda.
Elisa, Mike brought up, maybe just to paraphrase poorly, there's certainly a will among the international community, and there have been institutions implemented over the past 20 years that certainly have made a difference. But if there is a will, why isn't there always a way?
That's a good question. I want to also first just add my own thanks and reflection on Ambassador Williamson. He was an incredible, as you said, he was passionate about this, and I considered him just a partner in my own thinking about how to advance these issues with the U.S. government. And when I would go to him with an idea, he was always so encouraging. So it was always, let's do it. And he was in, and I talked about wanting to bring people together to cross party lines to talk about building consensus around human rights and prevention of mass atrocities. And he said, let's do it. And then he showed up and he helped bring people. And I just want to echo what Mike said. I miss him all the time. And we really, I hear his voice a lot saying, let's do it. And it's a great spirit to carry forward. When I think about have we learned the lessons and what have we learned, I sort of think about there's two bookends, or books really, actually, on either side. One was Samantha Power's seminal work, A Problem from Hell. And the other one was this book that the museum collaborated with Secretary Albright, Secretary Cohen, called Preventing Genocide, which was really the answers. This is a book that really is almost entirely recommendations for how to fix many of the problems that Samantha identified in the kind of bureaucratic structures. And in some ways now, what are we, maybe 6, 7, 8 years from when this came out, that looked very pragmatic. Now, in some ways, it seems somewhat naive in that the structures or the lessons that you learn, you can learn them kind of up here. But if we don't have the leadership, that's the way, that's the will. This is the way, but you have to also have the will. And I think that's something that we've learned. You can set up bureaucratic structures. They can improve the share of information. The president has now, President Obama has tasked the intelligence community to do an assessment, a risk assessment about mass atrocities around the world. And although it's classified, so we haven't seen it, that kind of information would be critical in feeding into a interagency process that could spark action at the right time. My own organization has been thinking about, okay, so what would it be like to be sitting in the driver's seat inside government when something like this starts to happen? How do you know when the moment is to elevate it to the next, office up the chain? And so we put together with the National Defense University this tabletop exercise, this simulation about an unfolding mass atrocity situation in real time with resources that come from better funded agencies than a nonprofit, to talk about, to kind of put policymakers through the paces. When would you flip the switch and elevate that? And it was very informative, and I think, hopefully it will, continue to be used, because, when the real thing happens, you don't have that many chances as it unfolds. Rwanda, yes, there were a lot of early warning signs, but that time passes very quickly, and it doesn't go on the same clock as government bureaucracy. So unless you're prepared and have the system set up, and then you marry that with the political will, which I hope we will talk about, whether it's Syria or the Congo or wherever it is. Without that, the structures are close to meaningless.
Well, if we're going to talk about something that should rise and elevate to the level of the top attention of the U.S. government, there's no more issue compelling than Syria. 150,000 dead, so many, in fact, that the UN has stopped counting. I think it's 6.5 million people now either internally displaced or refugees. And yet, this is, if there is anything, this is a clear call to action. And yet it seems like there's, for a number of reasons, both political and pragmatic, it seems like there's very little that the Obama administration either can do or is willing to do. So I think we all benefit from your experience, Fred.
Thank you, thank you. First, let me say simply, it's an honor to be in the presence of the Williamson family. It truly is. The title, part of the title of Sam Power's book, Problem from Hell, was mentioned. Syria is a problem from hell. And the first thing I would like to say, and I would like to acknowledge, is that there are no silver bullets here. There are no easy answers. I've been out of government at the Atlantic Council for a year and a half now, continuing to wrestle with a problem for which there were no easy answers. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was a career Army officer. I am the last person in the world who's looking for excuses to deploy our young men and women into more theaters of action. We've decided as a country that something like 1% of our fellow citizens are going to carry this burden. I think that's disgraceful, but that's a different subject. That's not why we're here tonight. Protection of civilians has not been a consistent theme, a consistent priority of the administration when it comes to Syria. It's been episodic at best. We all remember last summer what happened when on August 21st, the Assad regime committed a particularly heinous chemical atrocity. I say particularly heinous because it was about the 14th time that regime crossed President Obama's red line that had been declared the previous August. The president at the time, at the urging of Secretary Kerry, was evidently prepared to do a humanitarian intervention. We all know what happened. He passed the buck to Congress and eventually traded it in for an agreement that would get the offending weapons, the chemical weapons, out of Syria and neutralize the capability of the regime to use those weapons. The jury's still out on all of that. But what we've seen is the flip side of this is that the Syrian regime, with the full support of Iran and Russia, has doubled down on an unbelievable campaign of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The regime isn't the only guilty party here. There are al-Qaeda elements, there are jihadist elements who are also committing war crimes. All of this has been documented very accurately by a commission of inquiry that's reporting to the UN Human Rights Council. But what we've discovered, and I think it should have been clear from the beginning, that the chemical weapons atrocity is the tip of a very ugly, very deep iceberg that is producing the kinds of numbers you referred to. It's not easy for the administration to handle this. I would have thought last August and September, when the president was thinking about military intervention, an opportunity was at hand, an opportunity to go for a military mission that could be summarized with the following words: destroy or significantly degrade the ability of the Assad regime to bring massed fires, artillery, aircraft, rockets, missiles, to bear on civilian populations. Because it is this practice of indiscriminate bombardment, including everything such as the kitchen sink in barrel bombs. These things are unbelievably destructive. This is what is driving one of the signature humanitarian abominations of our lifetime. So we can return to this, I think, as we get into options for the future. But basically, it is a problem from hell, and there just has not been a rigorous disciplined focus on civilian protection.
You know, one of the things that we posed this panel, this question, have we learned our lesson? And, maybe it should be, what lessons have we learned? And one of the things I think we have learned, and it's true in Syria, and it's true, I think, in every situation of evolving mass atrocity, is that these are complex crimes. They have lots of moving parts. They require support. They require financial support, political support of the perpetrators. They require weapons, ammunition, transport, all of this stuff in order to perpetrate these crimes against civilians. And in Syria, for example, I don't think we can anticipate any change unless we can impact the calculus of Assad. And one way to do that is to change the calculus of his chief enablers, including Russia. We're talking about, you hear the administration and others now talking about sanctions against Russians and Russian banks. Well, hey, that was a strategy that should have been pursued, I think, very early with Syria, with respect to Syria. And that's one way to get the attention of the chief enablers of Assad. There was evidence quite early about Russian ammunition, Russian helicopters, attack helicopters, the very weapons that were being used to go after massacres Syrian civilians, going back to Russia to be repaired and then being shipped into Tartus. And there's a lot of moving parts to an operation like that, which means there are a lot of ways you can stop it, including pulling shipping certificates and letting the Russians know that we mean business. I think that's one of the ways that we, there were reasons, I guess, why there was some hope that the Russians would help solve the problem, but that's clearly not happening. And some of us thought that was never going to happen anyway.
Right.
So I think there are lots of options, between, American boots on the ground and heads in the sand. And I think that, one of the lessons that we need to learn from Rwanda is that these are complex situations and they require early action, and it doesn't always have to be war.
You mentioned the calculus there, right? And I keep thinking about the calculus of moral responsibility and where that falls in the decisions our government makes and we make as an international community intervening in these things. And Fred, I think you're right. These things, a conflict like Syria is not easy. It is fundamentally complicated. There are good reasons both for intervention, moral, humanitarian. There are good reasons not to get involved, and I think our administration would enumerate a lot of those. But Mike, where does the moral responsibility fall? How high should this be elevated?
Well,
and how big, does it take 150,000 people dead in Syria, or when we see the embers of conflicts in Central African Republic now,
right.
What's the trigger point?
Well, it's a great question. I would say, first of all, I think in general, this is a broad international responsibility. I think I think it's not just a U.S. responsibility, first of all, although I think that the U.S. can play a tremendous leadership role. I was struck, I was in Jordan just a few months ago, and I traveled to some of the refugee camps. And I also, in Amman, met with, about 600,000 Syrian refugees who have fled to Jordan. It's really destabilizing the whole region. And we spent a lot of time talking to people who had escaped. And what was interesting is that, while they are they're very cognizant of the geopolitical situation, and they feel very much abandoned, by the United States, because what they see is a proxy war going on in Syria. and you have kind of the supporters of Assad all in, Iran, Russia, really throwing everything into the fight, and they basically see hesitancy and equivocation on the side of the opposition. And so they very much feel betrayed. And so I'm not sure that's answering your question directly, but it really struck me that while the United States might want to escape decisions by not making a decision is in some ways a decision. So I think the responsibility falls with all of us. But the president takes his cues from the American public. Intervention is not at all popular, and that's not a new thing. The mass atrocity we study the most, up until the eve of World War II, the American people didn't want to get involved in the European conflict. So I do think that there are times, when leaders have to make decisions. So I guess to answer your question bluntly, I think in the end that's what you pay the President of the United States for.
Clemantine, can I just quickly sort of ask, or do you want to give somebody to respond?
You could ask the question. You could go ahead and ask the question.
I'll come back. Go ahead.
Well, I'm absolutely grateful. I think when you asked the first question, I just jumped in answering. I'm absolutely grateful to be here. 20 years ago, when I think of 20 years ago, and I think of myself as a 6-year-old who being taken away from my mother, my family, from people that I loved and I knew, and hiding from one place to another. I didn't think that people come together in this room and have a conversation like this, just like someone in Syria and in Central African Republic. No one has a clue that we're sitting in this room and having this conversation. And so when we think about the moral responsibility of the leaders that we are here, how can we come back to the shared humanity? Forget about our education. Forget about what we know about who's fighting who. Let's go back to what matters. There's a child, there's a man, there's a woman, and they're gonna be killed just because. So, could we as leaders having this conversation always bring ourselves back into that shared humanity? Could we dare as a leader making decision be mindful of those who we're making decisions for? I mean, my life is pure miracle. Sitting here was never even in a little glimpse. And so, as I sit here, and as you sit here, how can we be a little bit more mindful on the way we think about others? Can we think of them as our sisters and brothers, rather than the Syrian and the Africans and the this and that? Can we come back into there are people who need help? And I think unless we do that, we will never go anywhere. We're going to keep having this conversation. We're going to sit here with our waters, with our books. It's going to continue happening over and over again. And you're going to have one survivor sitting, and she's going to say something, who's going to say something, going to happen. But I really think that now, as we know this destruction continue to happen, is our responsibility and our obligation to be able to take care of some people like me, to nurture us, to take us under your wings, to teach us how these things work. So we could take care of our own countries. So we could sit on this panel and you could talk about what is happening in our own countries. And you could make a decision for our own countries. So in that, to say, a leader should be more mindful, should touch on the shared humanity. before they make a decision and say, let's just bomb. And so unless we do that, we're gonna just, this is gonna be just on a repeat.
I think that's beautifully said. Elisa, how do we combat the fatigue that so many of us feel, or, as a general public, with intervention, humanitarian intervention explicitly with the Syria conflict? I mean, even, this is a terrible metric, but even in foreign policy, I can't even tell you the amount of stories we've published over the past 3 years on the Syrian conflict, deep investigations, exclusive reports, but it's clear that there is a fatigue when wars and conflicts bleed for years. So how do we build, is it pressure at the top? Is it a grassroots support?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think that, one of the things we're experiencing in the United States now is the very strong hangover of the Iraq War effect. And I mean, the Syria, the pullback from the threatened action after the chemical weapons, the 14th chemical weapons attack, really brought that home, I think, to me, that the proposed action there, which really was fairly modest, or if you listen to Secretary Kerry, infinitesimal, was construed by large sectors of the American public as going to war, that would be the equivalent of going to war. And there's a deep distrust, I think, by many Americans of their government's ability to act in a way that involves, kinetic events in any way that will not enmesh us in a war. And that, I think, is a large hangover from Iraq, our experience in Iraq. But that's just a description of the problem. That's not a solution to the problem. And I do think that cultivating this sense of shared humanity that Clemantine talked about is essential, because Americans have very much, I think, as part of their identity as a nation, our identity as a nation, our, as Rich said, America's mission in the world. We see it as standing up for the ideals of human dignity. And when we fail to do that, we don't feel very good about ourselves. So cultivating that and transforming that into political demand for action is really important. You saw that in Darfur, where there was, the mall was filled with demonstrations by people who said, never again, not on our watch. And it did spur some commitment to action, including, sending Ambassador Williamson to help solve this problem. And, ironically, we now that also led to the creation of some bureaucratic structures and interagency processes and all of that. And in a sense, maybe people think, well, that's going to take care of it, so we don't need to be out on the mall demonstrating about what's going on in Syria. But for whatever reason, there's really a striking lack of a sense of outrage about, the damage done to our common humanity. I mean, the photographs of the victims of torture that came out of Syria were terribly reminiscent of things we saw from World War II. And yet there was no marching in the streets. There was no rally to call for action. In fact, most of the same people who were in the mall calling for action on Darfur were urging, no, don't get involved. Let's mind our own business. Let's not get enmeshed. It's terrible, but let's not get enmeshed in another war in the Middle East. I do think one lesson that we have learned somewhere, I don't know, we haven't actualized it, but intellectual at least we've learned, that mass atrocities and genocide is a national security problem for the United States. And the president has articulated that, and I don't think it's just words. I mean, I think we have seen the problems that result when these things go unchecked. And I mean, Syria is like that on steroids, right? That is really And that may be the reason we end up acting eventually in Syria.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to jump in one point, because this conversation, it's a great conversation, but I think is going in a direction that I think is a little bit unfortunate, because in this respect, and you're a great moderator, but the point I want to make is that you go from 0 to 60, you go right to the debate over military intervention. And there is no question in my mind that there are times when military intervention is justified. I mean, the Holocaust, be number one. And I suspect, in Syria, it's too far gone that actually changing the calculus on the ground is going to require some kind of, military action. So I'm not trying to be naive about this, but I think there is, Elisa touched on something early on, there's so much that we can do that is non-military if we pay attention to these crises ahead of time. One thing at the museum, we've had a project really looking deeply at the Rwandan Genocide. And the thing that there was a lot of tension after the president's plane was shot down. On April 6th in 1994, the president of Rwanda's plane was shot down. That was the trigger for the killing. But the people who were on the ground, who were really paying attention to that in the 2 or 3 years running up to that event, really foresaw the need, the risk of mass violence. There were, if you will say, warning signs of mass violence. There was hate speech. There was incitement. The radios as you talked about in your introduction, were calling the Tutsis cockroaches. And we know, again, from the Holocaust, that hate speech can be a warning sign of mass violence. There was a civil war that was going on. There were also previous cases of smaller massacres, pogroms, if you will, against the Tutsis. So for those who were following the situation closely, there were warning signs of catastrophe. But Rwanda was a small country. It was really off the radar screen of the President of the United States and other world leaders. They were focused on Bosnia, Somalia, other situations, and it kind of fell beneath the radar screen. I think what we're trying to do, and like with the Atrocities Prevention Board that they've set up, we're trying to put a closer focus on those countries that might become mass atrocity situations. Because in the long term, the best way to prevent genocide is to stop them from starting in the first place. Because once they start, your policy options are immediately circumscribed. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but there's a lot you can do earlier in the process to interrupt the progress of these societies to genocide.
Should we take some questions from the audience now? Do we have microphones to go around? Okay. I think, can we shout? Is it okay? Here, gentleman over here in the third row. Yes, you, sir. Please. And let's keep, I need to do this as a moderator, let's keep these questions short with a question mark at the end, so not a soapbox. Please, we've got an exceptional panel, so let's ask them.
Thank you very much. My name is Lee Akwete. I work on U.S. relations with Africa, look at the issues between the two places because I was born in Ghana, but this has been my home for 40 years. And I think this panel is great, especially the way the subject was couched as a question. Have we learned our lesson? And I came to offer an answer that I don't think we have. And I will go back a little bit more than Mr. Abramowitz did. Because the way I look at it, one of the major factors for what happened in Rwanda was not tribal hatred, even though there was some of it, but it was deep lack of democracy. And we have a record of supporting dictatorships across Africa. And in particular in Rwanda, my own opinion is that we have a dictatorship there now. They may be doing some good work, but I worry that if we continue, who knows what will happen again when we are supporting dictatorship. So
let me try and phrase that as a question. How much do political systems matter? And what is the, do we see this happening as much in democracies? Do we see Are they better at preventing them? I mean, I think our questioner has a good point that dictatorships perhaps are more prone to inciting this kind of ethnic violence. But do we see I don't know, Fred, if you want to tackle this one. But you've done an extraordinary amount of work in the Middle East. So, I mean, we talk about, the U.S. has supported governments that tamped these flames of ethnic violence for a long time, sometimes through brutal means.
Yeah, well, I think where I've really focused here is on Syria, and quite frankly, you had a regime that came to power in 1970, and its first priority was first to stamp out any kind of political opposition within its own sectarian group, within the Alawite community. And from there, basically build a poison pill into the system, where if there were ever a general uprising against this regime, Syria being 75% Sunni Muslim, if there were ever a general uprising, it would go sectarian very quickly. And once it goes sectarian, you're off to the races in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity. If I could just make one quick comment on the moral dimension here, because President Obama kind of addressed this in an interesting interview he did with New Republic a year ago, January. He said, people are asking me to do things. He said, there's a lot of killing going on in Congo. There's a lot of killing going on in Syria. How am I to choose? Okay, now that was not a very satisfactory way to put things in the minds of a lot of people, but it does raise a point, and it goes back to what I said earlier about the 1% of our fellow citizens who are bearing the burden here. There has to be an element of pragmatism built in here. If we're talking about military intervention, if we're talking about the United States, even at the head of a coalition, may not be able to be everywhere at all times. And I would just note that there's a very interesting article written by I believe it's University of Chicago professor named Richard Pape. Came out a couple of years ago. And what Pape is proposing is a new pragmatic standard for intervention. His thesis is that genocide is too high a bar, for the very practical reason that by the time people get done investigating whether or not genocide is taking place, you're already two-thirds through the process. What Pape is suggesting is that we look at three things, basically. Number one, is there an ongoing campaign of mass homicide going on? Second, if you're looking at military intervention, can you actually do something that addresses that problem significantly with minimal or no casualties on the part of the intervening force? And third, if you do intervene, are you leaving behind a security situation that is measurably better than the one you were facing before intervention? This sort of thing requires a lot of study before it becomes any kind of government doctrine. But I would suggest for people who are interested in this issue, Richard Pape's work on pragmatic humanitarian intervention, I think, is worth some study.
Mike, you wanted to say something, or should we take
Elisa,
it?
I do. I just want to underscore, I think this is absolutely the right question and point. I mean, if you have a democracy, not just elections, but democratic institutions, free press, protection of minority rights, that is an anti-genocide, that's a genocide prevention strategy. And that's what Mike was talking about in terms of like looking way ahead, and how do we build the institutions that would prevent something like this from getting started. And to the extent that we want to, when we tend to think about those things in separate, separate parts of the government even, but investing in promoting respect for human rights, democratic institutions, that really should be part of a genocide prevention strategy. I think it's an excellent point, really important.
Right. I was just going to agree with that. The countries that commit genocide or mass atrocities are not democracies. I think the dangerous point, though, is sometimes the countries that are in transition between dictatorship and democracy, those are the ones that are at risk. And that's what you saw in Rwanda in 1994. They were trying to transition to a democratic system, and essentially one of the parties took extreme measures to wipe out what they perceived to be their political opposition.
Over here. Just 1 second, the microphone's coming.
Good evening, Professor Ethan Kapstein from the McCain Institute. Very moving panel. My last book was about one of the great tragedies of recent times, the global HIV/AIDS tragedy, where millions and millions of people were lost. Over a decade, the international community did nothing. It finally responded when AIDS activists created a real politics around AIDS treatment, a real politics which involved people like Senator Jesse Helms, the evangelical movement here, ultimately President Bush. My question to this panel is, do communities like yours, people concerned about genocide, need to create a real politics, a domestic politics around these issues, which ultimately may be what forces change? Thank you.
That's a great question. Clementine, I think this is a perfect one for you. How do we go from grassroots movements and people campaigning on the mall to actually enforcing some stakes for officials in government or officials in the international community, that if they don't act, there are penalties from the public?
Well, approaching from a humanitarian perspective, I would say what I do every day is to remind people, standing in front of people for an hour and reliving my own painful experiences so that people can learn that this so-called term genocide, there's so much pain behind it. There's so much destruction behind it and the ugly history behind it. So it's not just this flat word. So breaking down the term itself is a way to conquer it. Because once you break the world, that term, then you see the ugliness behind it. And then people scream. They said, I had no idea what happens after genocide. What happens after genocide in Rwanda? You're speaking about AIDS. You know how many women were left, raped, little girls raped? Now they're HIV positive. And not only that, do you know how many people were left homeless? Do you know how many people were left with no single penny in the bank? They had nothing. They had to start from zero. Rwanda looks really great. Let's look at Bosnia. Where is Bosnia right now? Where is Burma right now? So it's really important to look, not to only look at the term itself and use all this very big vocabulary, to look at the destruction that this thing called genocide left behind. Because I think when we look at it, then we said, it's very scary. So I don't think campaigning and building more language around it, it just confuses people. When you show people being homeless, people who had families, only one member's left, and that member getting up and sharing their story, that's the way for me to campaign. For people, survivors, to get up and share their stories. And so that no one else share their stories. I think that's the way to help people understand the destruction of it. And I think for me, that's where I will approach it if I had the ability. And I am doing a little bit of part of it every day. So I hope that answers.
I just, one last point on that. I think that one way to combat the fatigue and to turn grassroots into political pressure, we have to do a better job, as Michael was saying, about explaining that we can make a difference. There have been success stories, but you don't read about them on the front because they're, bad things did not happen, or things didn't happen as badly as they could have. And we have to do a better job of making people, Americans and others, feel a sense of agency. We can act, and if we do so early enough, then we're not talking about the 1% having to put their lives on the line. We're really talking about investment of our government's energy and ideas in building democratic institutions. And I mean, Kenya is a very striking example of that, but most people don't really think about that as a genocide success story.
Of course. Another question? Right here.
My name is Mary Ann Stein. I'm with the Fund for Global Human Rights. I know a couple of you at least. And I want to take one tack on what you were saying, and I'm sorry, but I haven't yet internalized your name. I'm going to have to work at it. But it seems to me, in addition to the issue raised by this gentleman of democracy, there is the issue of the fact that there are these schisms and hatreds between groups in not just countries, but regions and locales that are utilized by usually despots or horrible leaders who somehow come to the fore. And I'm wondering whether we need somehow, at least in the international community or somewhere, to be attempting to address, along the lines of what you were saying, this concept of shared humanity, in trying to recognize the role of these divisions and these senses of others being inferior and not really human in terms of our abilities to kill them. And I also am interested, Elisa, in what you were saying, and Mike, you also said it, in terms of alternatives to the military and educating people more about ways that we have been able to intervene successfully, meaning without a whole lot of source on our part. I do think it's really important to educate, certainly our public, about ways that one not only can intervene, but also how you get out. What's the end point? How do we not do more damage by intervening, and how do we limit our involvement? And that's never clear, and I think that that's a lot of, yes, there is this tiredness about these issues, but I think it is also a sense of, oh my God, look at what we did in Latin America. Sure. Every time we intervened, we made everything really awful. And there's
let me sort of jump in there. Thank you. No, you brought up a lot of good points. I mean, who wants to tackle this? I mean, are ethnic and sectarian hatreds always going to be there? Is it always the Red Sox hate the Yankees and the Yankees hate the Red Sox?
It's not that bad.
It's not that bad.
I would make 2 points. First of all, I do actually believe in the long term that education is key. I mean, I think, it's a long process. A lot of the world right now, illiteracy still is a problem. But I do think in the long term, education is key. I would just make one other just brief point, because you asked a lot of good stuff. But I do think that it's important to understand that the cases of the most egregious mass violence are not cases of just spontaneous tribal eruptions. They are deliberately manufactured by political leaders. I think committing genocide is a political act. I think Fred described it well in the case of Syria. This is a tactic that's been unleashed by the Assad regime in Rwanda, in the Holocaust, in Cambodia. Mass killing was a political tactic. And so it has to be That's why also I think there's hope for prevention, because if you can intervene earlier, you can either deter the perpetrators, hopefully, or inoculate the people through education against being receptive to incitement. I mean, I think there are different things you can do over the long term, but it needs to be understood as a political process, in my view.
I actually also just wanted to say also education and opportunities. And thinking about Rwanda right now, there are a lot of young people who are coming out of this sort of ashes we're speaking about. And they're being told that they have to live with each other. And they're being told that they're the next leaders. How are you going to be next leader without having a great education? To understand what kind of leader you will be, a different leader from the leaders that we've had. But not only that, opportunities. And so this is where I encourage institutions, international institutions, this is their opportunity to welcome and invite young people from Rwanda to Burundi, to Congo, to Uganda, to everywhere, all these different places where we speak that the genocides have happened, to bring them and nurture them and take care of them. Like I said at the beginning, once you nurture and take care of them in terms of education, they will know what to do. But you cannot expect out of nowhere, well, they're just killing each other. Of course, there is some, they have not had opportunity. Only thing that they think about is probably little centimeters around their house, right? But giving them a global perspective, throwing them, in a classroom with the other students, throwing them to different leadership positions where they cannot debate as Rwandans, but they have to debate as a country from China, right? You're China now, go, right? So I really believe in education and opening up opportunities on all these institutions that have been already established. I am a result of one of those institutions, and there's nothing special about me at all. So that's where I would say that will change.
Another question from the audience? I saw a hand shoot up very quickly there. And let's keep these questions. I don't think we've got a ton of time left, so let's keep them short.
Right. Distinguishing, say, the difference between Syria, where there's a complicated civil war, versus, say, the Central African Republic, where I think the United Nations is sending troops in, the African Union is sending troops in, where the troops on the ground can make a difference. Shouldn't the United States be playing a role there actively with some of our troops and some of our logistical support? Shouldn't we be talking about that and enlisting other European countries to do the same? Because it seems to me one of the problems here, there's not enough people on the ground to protect the families there. And shouldn't the United States be playing an active role? And shouldn't the organizations up front be advocating that?
That's a good question. Fred and Mike, do either of you want to tackle this?
Well, I do think there are about 100,000 peacekeepers around the world right now. Not many of them are Americans, not many of them are Canadians. We've basically subcontracted peacekeeping to a number of African countries. Interesting, Rwanda has actually taken a big role in peacekeeping all across Africa, probably as a result of their own experience. I've not been following the Central African Republic as probably closely as some others here, but I do think the United States does provide they can move troops around. So they've actually helped, I think, helicopter, move peacekeepers into some of these areas. But there's probably a lot more that I think Western countries can do in these cases. I think in Libya you saw that, within 3 days, a pretty robust military intervention was affected because basically the countries of the West decided they wanted to stop it. So a lot of it is will.
I think in a lot of these situations there is no particular comparative advantage for putting American soldiers or Marines on the ground. As Mike indicates, there are a lot of services we can bring into the picture in many of these situations, whether they're logistical, intelligence, or so forth. But I think given the pace of deployments that our uniformed people undergo these days, that ought to be the last resort. And that's why even though some of us who are naturally, because of background, very reluctant to think about military operations here, even to the extent we do think about them in Syria, boots on the ground, absolute no-go under all situations. Absolute no-go. It is a complicated civil war. This is one of the reasons why the administration has argued against doing anything. But again, and this goes back to the question about, do you get on a slippery slope? Some of these military interventions have ended badly in the past. Believe me, from a professional point of view, it all has to do with defining the military mission and the desired end state with exact precision. This should not be beyond the capacity of the American Commander-in-Chief or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And if we're focusing in Syria rigidly on humanitarian outcomes, there are things that can be done.
Hi, Connor Sanchez. I'm curious on your thoughts. You mentioned it, Mike, on Libya and the intervention there, and in terms of what can be learned there in terms of best practices or lessons learned for next time.
Well, I would really defer to the military expert on Libya. I think the thing that strikes me about Libya was that Gaddafi had lost all his friends in the region. All the neighbors wanted him gone. Basically, Russia and China, in kind of a strange, really unique situation, gave the United States and the other countries a pass. And so that was a unique situation that I think has also impacted the Syria conflict and made it...
Well, and according to Professor Pape, who I mentioned before, Libya was the ideal 3 check marks for his criteria, okay? What's happened in Libya since the intervention, although I think nobody, aside from his immediate family, is mourning the passing of Muammar Gaddafi. What's happened in Libya is that there simply has not been a successful effort yet to mend together some kind of legitimate governance system. Not that Gaddafi was all that legitimate, but in terms of stopping an ongoing program of mass homicide, in terms of intervention that costs the interveners precisely 0 in the way of casualties, and in terms of leaving behind a situation that on balance was better than the forthcoming mass massacre of Benghazi. I think Professor Pape would argue, he did argue in his 2012 paper, that the Libyan intervention was fully justified on humanitarian grounds.
The problem is that things don't stay the same. It depends on when you take that measure about whether we've left a secure, a security situation that's better than, and if you don't invest and commit to doing that at the front end,
right,
then that can unravel very quickly, and that's what we're seeing in Libya now. I think there's a real risk that devolves into more violence. So it really is important. I think, your point, Fred, is and his, that you think about what are you willing to invest in creating a security situation that will hold to build a better future for the country. If we're not committed to doing that, then that I think that weighs against the intervention.
I think you're right.
Doesn't that, though, also, if we're weighing intervention with the back end, that we need to be there to support this, doesn't that then, it works against, it makes it more difficult for us to intervene because that we are already coming with the notion that we're going to have to stay there to work through the process?
Well, it might, but we have to be big people about that and assess the situation and say, and that's what the political leadership needs to make the case to the American people. And this is what is in our interest, and this is what we assess that it's going to take. So we can't have it both ways, you know. And if it truly is in our interest to have a stable and democratic Libya, then we have to think about what's our responsibility to make that happen.
And again, I can't emphasize this enough. So much depends on the definition of the military mission and the end state required. Last summer, to the extent anybody was asking from the Pentagon was asking me for advice, the military mission I was recommending was destroy or significantly degrade the ability of the Assad regime to bring massed fires to bear on civilian populations. That does not put the United States into the middle of a Syrian civil war in terms of defining winners or losers. It very simply takes the position that a regime that no longer has artillery, no longer has an air force, no longer has Scud missiles, no longer has long-range rockets, is less able to commit mass homicide on a daily basis. And there's no doubt in my mind that millions of Syrian people would be much better off today. A lot of them, for starters, would be alive if that's the step we had taken.
That's pragmatic, Fred, but is it enough? I mean, there were no mass fires in the Rwandan genocide, right? These were horrific crimes committed with sticks and clubs and neighbor against neighbor.
And even the professor I mentioned, Professor Pape, argued in early 2012, and I agreed with him then, when I was a government official, that at that particular point in early 2012, when what was going on, demonstrations in Syrian cities and so-called security forces sniping, picking off leaders, killing lots of people. There could not have been an effective military intervention at that point. How in the world could you do airstrikes when what you're dealing with are mass demonstrations in urban areas and government security forces shooting people? The situation has evolved since then, so that there are large tracts of Syria that are not controlled by the regime. And it is there that the regime is using its artillery and its aircraft, rockets and missiles to create mass indiscriminate slaughter.
I think we have time for one more question, then I know the panel has a lot of stuff to say. Let's just go quickly. We can take the two and we'll just do them as one. Here and then there quickly.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Volker. I'm with Cure Violence. And we know that violence leads to more violence. And we also know that people take their cues from what they think other people expect of them or think would be acceptable. And so in the case of a country or a leader of a country, his peers would be other countries or other heads of state. What more could we be doing to send the right signals to show that we care about the humanity, the people that are being killed, and not have episodic interest in civilians being killed, but a continuous moral outrage with the civilians being killed?
And over here.
Oh, thank you. Okay, my name is Yukeri Ambachu. I'm the president of Voices of Women of Children in Africa and Diaspora. I thank you very much for organizing this seminar today. But I have this problem and issue that's been bothering me and many women in Africa today, especially what is going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's been estimated that about 5 million people had been died, and every day women and children are being raped in that country. And there are so many people involved. The Rwanda government with their M3 is involved. Museveni, also government is involved. And also there are so many mercenaries involved in that country. Would you characterize what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo today as a genocide or just another ethnic war in Africa?
That's a good and difficult question. Mike, do you want to tackle that one? It's a question, I think the question of semantics is extremely important. And you brought up the need to respond to triggers early?
Right. Well, I'd like to answer Karen's question too, because I thought about Karen's question, but just on Congo, listen, there's no question from reading human rights reporting that there is war crimes being committed, mass rape, ethnic cleansing in some cases over the last 18 years or 20 years. So, I mean, I'm usually kind of reluctant to use the word genocide. I think it should be, I think it's a rare crime. It's also, frankly, kind of hard to confirm it. I mean, we're still debating 40 years after the fact, whether Cambodia constituted genocide or not. Scholars debate that or not. I think it's actually in some ways not a useful debate to have, because I think the point, as one of my co-panelists made earlier, is you want to intervene early to avoid the genocide from happening in the first place. And so I think one of our messages is to try to get away from this kind of semantic argument and try to have early intervention to prevent crimes from metastasizing into the worst. I do think, on Karen, on your point on the how do you deter leaders, it's a really interesting question, because I think it's actually more complex than your question suggested. I think clearly you take a case like Sudan, where you have I believe, a genocidal leader in Sudan who has committed certainly war crimes and crimes against humanity, really all over the country, in the south, in Darfur, also in the Nuba Mountains, which is a very relatively underappreciated set of mass violence. And he is now under indictment by the International Criminal Court. He basically can't travel freely, and countries in Africa have shunned him. And the United States, really, I think maybe Rich might have been the last U.S. envoy to actually meet with President Bashir, I think in 2007, before the indictment. And so shunning is one possibility, but the reality is, how do you get a solution in Sudan without actually negotiating with him is a complex question. So I'm not saying I have an easy answer to that, but I think the question of how you deal with these rogue leaders is a profoundly challenging one, and it's not one size fits all. You're going to have to do different things in different countries. I'm not sure you can negotiate with Assad anymore. I think it's too far gone, but there might be other cases where you can negotiate. I mean, just remember, I always think in terms of our museum, Raoul Wallenberg went into Hungary and negotiated with Eichmann to try to save Jews. And so you got to, it's on a case-by-case basis.
I think we're about time to wrap up. So I'd like to sort of run down the panel, starting with the Clemantine, to ask you, what should the international community do, and what is, the McCain Institute for International Leadership, what is the role of leadership in making sure that we've learned the lessons of Rwanda 20 years later?
It's a very big, intense question, but
You have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Being mindful, absolutely being mindful as a leader, and making decisions that you would want someone to make for you and for your family. And that mindfulness comes with practice, and not that kind of practice of the old way. So I would say being mindful. If you don't want it to happen to you, don't sign up for someone else. So mindfulness and awareness.
Elisa.
So I think, again, we asked the question, have we learned our lesson? And I think one lesson that I've learned from the Rwandan genocide and what's happened since is that all the work that we've done to establish bureaucratic institutions, to produce more early warning information about impending genocide, to bring interagency actors together, to make, that's all important, very important. But without leadership, it really won't amount to very much. In the end, it really is about political leadership, to explain to the American people why why it's important for us to act, and why we need to build the institutions that, that we know will prevent genocide and other mass atrocities. It's really all about leadership.
Fred.
Yeah, my comments follow on to this, I think, almost seamlessly. We've mentioned Samantha Power's book, Problem from Hell. It is the Bible on these kinds of issues. For those of you who haven't read it, I urge you to read it. And take a look at it as she does the compendium of excuses rendered for inaction. Take a look at those traditional excuses from 20th century practice and see how they apply directly to Syria. And consider her central finding about what happened in the 20th century when the United States acted either well or poorly. What was the critical variable? And this follows on to your statement, Elisa. It was leadership, and specifically, it was the President of the United States. Our default position as a people, and it's fully understandable, it's regrettable, but it's understandable, our default position until we build the kinds of political support structures for this, our default position is, oh, you know, what's happening is terrible. It's terrible. But ultimately, it's not our business. We've got a lot of things going on in this country. We've got a lot of problems. Let somebody else take care of this one. Let's take a pass. Unless you have the President of the United States intervening in that and explaining to people why these things are important, you're basically nowhere.
Well, I violently agree with all my panelists. You have kind of a boring panel here, but I would just say I think presidential leadership is decisive. I think basically whether we're talking about the early preventive steps that are necessary to prevent conflicts from metastasizing to military intervention, it's never popular to try to get involved. I mean, the countries where some of the countries, as Madeline Albright says, far-off places with funny-sounding names, never very popular to get involved in. South Sudan, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast. But I do think that presidential leadership is decisive, and you can just look, I would just say two things. You look at the Clinton administration. Clinton could have acted on Rwanda, really not at a very sizable cost. He didn't. Then several years later, he did act on Kosovo to stop what he believed was going to be mass violence in Kosovo. So I do think that presidential leadership, as Fred says, is decisive. And I do think the other thing I would just close with is that what I find very interesting from studying the history of the 20th century in some of these cases, really starting with the Holocaust, going up through Darfur, if you talk to President Clinton, I used to be a reporter, you interview them, or President Bush, George W. Bush, they don't go into office thinking about how to stop genocide, but I can guarantee you it's what they regret. And I know that President Bush deeply regretted that he did not fail, that he did not act aggressive enough on Darfur. I know that President Clinton has said his failure to act on the Rwandan genocide was one of his greatest regrets. And it'll be interesting to see what President Obama says 10 years down the road when he's writing his presidential memoirs.
Well, I love that we've ended on leadership. I want to thank the panel and hand this over to Ambassador Volker.
Great. And I want to just say thank you to each of you, Clemantine, Elisa, Fred, Mike, and also to you, Ben, for doing a nice job moderating us through this. If we could have a round of applause for it. We will be having a reception upstairs for those of you who would like to come, but before we do that, I'd like to introduce also Senator McCain to say a few words.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. It's really not only timely, but I think it's a debate that needs to be had, and frankly, in every living room in America. And I also happen to agree with the need for presidential leadership, but I won't go into that too far.
Jane, thank you for being here. I also think that this discussion would be most appreciated by one of the great advocates and actors in the human rights arena for many years, and of course, that's Ambassador Rich Williamson, who was also a very integral and part of an important part of the International Republican Institute and many other efforts. And we mourn his passing, but we praise his service, and we're very grateful for it. And again, I thank all of you for your involvement and engagement. I think that the world is where it is today is one of the more unusual situations that we have ever observed, and I see people all over the world re-examining the post-Cold War era and whether the expectations for that have actually been realized, and whether we are really entering a very different era in which human rights may be the foremost casualty, very frankly, of a very unsettled earth. So that, thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. And this is, again, I want every American family, particularly those who have sons and daughters who are serving our country, whether it be in the diplomatic corps or the military or so many other ways of serving this country, who may literally be in harm's way. Thank you.
And that concludes our program. Thank all of you very much for dedicating your time to this evening.